is it possible to organize society to minimize this corruption? So in other words, no matter what system you have, corruption is inevitable, because even a perfect system is going to be implemented imperfectly because man himself is not perfect. And that corruption is one noticeable aspect of that imperfection. So, if we cannot eliminate corruption, is there any way that we can minimize it? Okay, we're still on vacation here, and we're back at the beach, and behind me you see the waters of Grand Traverse Bay splashing against the shore, and if you look out way over there on the horizon, that is the tip of the Leelanau Peninsula, and it's a bright sunny day, beautiful weather, a bit windy and a bit chilly for swimming. I think if you want to come here for swimming or that kind of thing, probably July is probably the best time to come up here. And of course that's the peak of tourist season, so it'll be a lot more crowded. Okay, so yeah, today I thought I would talk a little bit about something I've thought quite a bit about, and it's regarding politics and corruption. So what can we say about that? Well, I suppose the first question that really comes to mind is that you could ask yourself, is government really necessary? And that whole topic of debate is a story for another day. So you have basically two options. You have anarchy or you have some sort of government. Like I said, that's a whole can of worms. I don't want to get into that right now. So in this discussion, I'm going to make the assumption that government, some form of government, is necessary. And if you recall, with the Declaration of Independence, there's this a portion or a phrase in the Declaration of Independence where he talks about our certain inalienable or unalienable rights, being the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then right after that, he follows up with that. He says it's for these rights that government is instituted. So the exact phrase is that to secure these rights, the right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So bear that in mind. According to the thought of the founding fathers, that is the reason for government. But notice that they don't really get into what type of government. So there's actually a lot of different types of government. But the thing is, we need some sort of government. So then we come to the question of, well, okay, what options do we have? So in other words, what systems of governments are typical or do we have available? And I would just note, first of all, I'm not going to get into it, but I would encourage you to notice that for each one of these that I'm going to mention briefly here, there are pros and cons to all of them. Okay? So first off, you can have a theocracy, where in a theocracy you're talking about government by some kind of religious ruler. So a democracy We have a monarchy, and a monarchy is a very ancient and traditional type of government where you're ruled by a king or a queen or that kind of thing. And you have a republic. That's another form of government. And with a republic, you have representatives that are supposed to represent you in the government. The most famous one, apart from the American Republic, is the Roman Republic. Before the time of Caesar and all that, Julius Caesar was the first one to kind of break away from the Roman Republic and instituted the time of the Caesars. Then we have democracy. And democracy is, rather than having laws and stuff made by representatives and carried out in that fashion, democracy, that people have direct election or direct referendum on the different laws and stuff. And sometimes democracy has often been called rule by the mob because it can very quickly turn into the tyranny of the majority. Then we have a dictatorship where you have one person that rules absolutely and nobody can go against him. And then the final one I would mention here is an oligarchy where the people are ruled by some group of elites. So those are the basic systems of government that we have. And like I said, there's pros and cons to all of them. Believe it or not, you can even say that there are pros to a dictatorship, because we have a tendency to think of a dictatorship as absolutely evil and a democracy or republic is absolutely good, and that's not true. Every single one of those has good things about it and bad things about it. So I would just ask you to keep that in mind. Then, of course, we have some mixing and matching of these different types of government. So you can have a constitutional monarchy, for example, like they have in the Scandinavian countries. You can have a democratic republic, which is actually what we have in America here. Then I would also mention that there have been several thought experiments throughout the years. First of all, there's Plato's Republic, where he imagined about the ideal society or the ideal form of government. And I'm not going to get into all the particulars of these. If you are interested, I would encourage you to research this on your own. But we have Plato's Republic, and he kind of advocated for the heavy hand of the state governing everything, even child rearing and taking over the job of what we would consider the parents' job of raising children and all that kind of stuff. But it's very heavy-handed. The state would play a very heavy hand with that. And then another famous thought experiment is More's utopia. And utopia literally means no place. So in other words, this place doesn't really exist. But utopia was more or less assuming that basically that crime or whatever occurred because things weren't fair, things weren't equitably distributed, and that kind of stuff. So in my opinion, that's based on a faulty assumption. I think he got it wrong about what the cause of crime is. And then another very famous thought experiment regarding government is Leviathan. So I would encourage you to take a look at those. But my point is that no single system of governance is perfect. Like I said, there are pros and cons to each one of them. And namely, that means that every one of those systems has flaws. Even democracy has flaws. Even a republic has flaws. A theocracy, a monarchy, a dictatorship, oligarchy. All those have good points, but most importantly, all of them have flaws. So no system is perfect. And you could write up what you consider to be the ideal system of governance. You could say it's the most fair, it's the most equitable, blah, 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 blah. But no matter how perfect it is, it's going to degrade over time. It can start off up here being good, and before you know it, it will just get worse and worse and worse and worse. And I think if we look at our own country as an example, but you could pick other countries as examples too. You could pick the US, you could pick Great Britain, you could pick countries in Europe, you could pick countries anywhere. They maybe start off well, but they degrade over time. And I believe that's partly related to the flaws of that system. And probably the single biggest flaw of all these systems is that they fail to take into account human nature. So if you think about human nature, people are selfish and very, me first and all that. And I think that's, if you keep that in mind, I think you'll understand that why these systems fail, or at least they degrade over time. So because these systems fail to acknowledge human nature, I believe that virtually guarantees that the system, any system, I don't care what it is, republic or democracy or dictatorship or oligarchy, any system that fails to take into account human nature is guaranteed to fail at some point. It will degrade until it no longer functions. So that's an important point, I believe. Even a so-called perfect system is bound to fail. Because you may have a so-called perfect system, but the thing is, who implements that system? Human beings. Man. Man implements that system. And man has a fallen human nature. Man himself is not perfect. Even if you don't want to look at it in terms of Christian theology, you don't have to be a Christian or anything to acknowledge that man himself is not perfect. Man does things that he should not do. And because of that, because man is not perfect, even a perfect system is bound to fail. So in other words, all the flaws that we can point out are going to be system independent. It doesn't matter what system of government you have. Flaws are going to crop up and degrade over time, and the whole thing will go south. It's inevitable. And I would just say that, again, we have a tendency to think that no matter what country you live in, you have a tendency to think that your country's government or system of government is the norm, and you judge everything else by that. So you tend to think that your system of government is the best. But that's not true. And I would even say that, a benevolent dictatorship is better than a corrupt democracy. And I know it sounds kind of heretical to a lot of people. It sounds like that's something you shouldn't say. But if you think about it, it's true. It would be better to be ruled by a dictator who is wise and kind and thoughtful and truly does things for the better of the people. That would be preferable to living in a democracy or a republic where the politicians are corrupt and they can be bought, and so then money rules everything, right? So, yeah, there's flaws for everything. And those flaws arise because man himself is flawed. I've been thinking, and what I've noticed, and I'm sure that if you consider what I'm saying, you'll tend to agree, but it seems like any system, no matter what, monarchy, republic, democracy, whatever, any system is going to attract the wrong people. So what do I mean by that? You have people that, okay, a government has to be implemented by people. You have politicians, you have ministers in the government, whatever. The wrong people tend to go into those positions. The liars, those that are greedy, those that are power hungry. And it's obvious why they want to go in there, because they use that position to enrich themselves. They use that to put themselves in a place of benefit. They use it to line their own pockets. They use the system to grow their own wealth and to benefit their family and all that. But it gets worse than that, because not only do you have the liars and the greedy and the power hungry and all that, you also have people that maybe they have good intentions. And I don't doubt that. I don't doubt that there are a number of people that get into politics because they truly want to help improve society. They truly want to help their neighbor, all that kind of stuff. But the thing is, a lot of them have a weak character. So in other words, they have standards, they have ideals, but then they get corrupted by the system over time. They're easily corrupted. They lack conviction. You start waving money under their nose and they're going to say, I can do what's right, or I can, enrich myself and my family if I, do what Group X tells me to do, or what have you. So they maybe want to do the right thing, but gradually the system changes their mind, and the longer they're in the system, the more corrupted they become. So that's what I mean when I say that any system seems to attract the wrong people, those with base motives and those with noble motives. And if those with noble motives lack conviction, they lack the character, they have a weak character, it just spells doom. And it was put this way, you may have heard this quote, you probably heard this quote, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And actually the full quote of that goes, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are almost always bad people. And the guy that said that, the guy that quote is attributed to, is a British politician named Lord Acton. And I think he made a very astute observation. It kind of goes back to what I was just saying about you can have good people with noble motives, pure motives, but when they get into the system, they get corrupted. They get a taste of that power, it goes to their head, and then they want more, And before you know it, they're just as dirty and corrupt as the rest. If you haven't already watched it, there's an oldie moldy movie. It's black and white, but probably I imagine you could find a colorized version if you're really turned off by black and white. But there was a famous movie, I believe it was from the 40s, I'm not sure, but that time frame. It had Jimmy Stewart in it, and I don't remember what the name of the other guy, but he's a well-known actor from that time. But it's called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and it kind of deals with this concept of the squeaky clean guy who starts off wanting to do the right thing, and then he goes to Washington and he butts heads with all the power brokers in Washington, and because he doesn't want to go along with what they're telling him. See, I think what it was is like there was a vacancy of some sort, and then he got suggested to be put in that position, and the political machine let him go into that position because they figured that they could manipulate him, that he would just, roll over and do whatever they wanted him to do. And he surprised them because he stood against them. And so because he wouldn't play the game with them, they tried to destroy him. But anyways, that's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. If you haven't seen that, I suggest that you take a look at it. Like it's got to be at least 70 or 80 years old, I bet, but it's really kind of prescient. And I think it also kind of, not really good news, but it just kind of lets us know that this whole thing about corruption and everything, it's nothing new. As long as man has walked this earth, there's been corruption. So we can kind of, I guess in a sense, take solace in that. But yeah, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are almost always bad men. Okay, so I think that leads us logically to this question: is it possible to organize society to minimize this corruption? So in other words, no matter what system you have, corruption is inevitable, because even a perfect system is going to be implemented imperfectly because man himself is not perfect. And that corruption is one noticeable aspect of that imperfection. So if we cannot eliminate corruption, is there any way that we can minimize it? And I thought about it for what it's worth. And in my mind, it seems like the bigger the government, the more likely you are to have corruption. Because you have a bigger government, there's more ministers and politicians and bureaucrats and all that kind of stuff running around. And so it's easier to form coalitions and all that kind of stuff, and play games and bend people to do your will. So, in my opinion, if you have a smaller government, I believe it would be harder to corrupt. And it's related to what I've heard before, and I've said it before. The bigger the government, the smaller the individual. And the bigger the individual, the smaller the government. But that's my opinion. Maybe you have some other ideas about how we could minimize corruption. Like I said, I don't think we can fully eliminate it. I think that's impossible. As long as man's involved, you're not going to be able to eliminate it. As long as human beings are involved in politics, corruption is inevitable. So, what kind of solutions do we have then? So, various thinkers and that have proposed different solutions. So, some people might say, well, education. Education is the answer. If people were just educated, if they were smarter, then they could figure out some kind of government that would eliminate corruption or at least minimize corruption. But I don't know. I don't think that any politician alive today is as smart as the founding fathers. I mean, they read all the classics. They read Greek and Latin, and they thought deeply about these things when they were setting up the government. So if they tried and failed, I don't think anybody today would be able to come up with anything better. And I think as far as education goes, it seems like education, if you just educate people, sometimes all you get is people who are smart or educated, but they're still corrupt. Corruption is not an issue of being smart or being dumb. So education doesn't address the root cause. Now, that's not to say that I want to be governed by a bunch of idiots. That's not helpful either. But education itself is not sufficient. Now, some others would say, well, the problem with politics is that there's too much money involved. So if, and you usually hear this in terms of like, why don't regular people run for office? It's because you need a ton of money to campaign and all that stuff. You need so much money for commercials and blah, 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 blah. So if we somehow took money out of politics and had some system of wealth equity, then that would solve the corruption problem. And I don't think that's really the answer either. I mean, to a certain degree, I think that if you can get the money out of politics, maybe that might help, but that you can have things officially, there's not going to be money involved in politics, but that behind the scenes, somebody's going to pull somebody aside and, hey, you do what I want, or if you vote this way on this bill that I want you to, then I'm going to give you this money, and it's all hush hush and all that kind of stuff. So you could make it official that somehow money is not going to be involved in politics, but that it's still going to go on. Because just because you pass a law forbidding this or forbidding that, that doesn't really stop it, does it? It might reduce it, but it doesn't stop it. So another suggestion or a proposal that people have is some kind of behavioral stuff. So if you train up people in the right way so they behave societally in a socially acceptable way, then that would take care of it. And I'm skeptical of that one too, because we've already tried social engineering and different things like that, and things are just getting worse and worse. Social engineering, you got to think this way and not think that way. I'm highly skeptical that would really do anything. I mean, we don't need a bunch of robots as far as that goes. And then others might say, well, since it's a spiritual issue, the issue of man having a fallen nature, of man not being perfect, if it's a spiritual issue or spiritual root cause, then you need a spiritual solution. And I think this is probably closer to the truth. Of course, I'm a Christian, so that is going to be, that's going to be something that I think rings true. But if you stop and think about it, that does kind of make sense. If you believe that man is not perfect, I say fallen nature because that's what the Christian theology teaches. But like I said, if you're not a Christian, you maybe say, well, man is inherently good or whatever. And just for the sake of argument, I'll say, okay, that may be. I don't agree with it personally, but that may be. But even if you start with the premise that man is inherently good, that's not going to bring you to the point to say that man does everything good, that man does everything perfect. I mean, you'd have to be locked in a room somewhere and have no interaction with other people to believe that man is perfect. And I don't see how anybody can really hold to that concept. So, yeah, man is not perfect. That indicates there's a spiritual problem at the root of everything. And if there's a spiritual problem, then the only way to fix that is with a spiritual solution. And so from this point, I'm going to outline some thoughts on what that spiritual solution would look like from a Christian perspective. So what does the Bible have to say about the system of government? Well, it doesn't really say a lot, actually. If you read in the Old Testament, it talks about God sets up the governing plan for theocracy. And right away, when you start talking about a theocracy, most people get really nervous. Oh, we can't do that. What about people who don't believe? So I would say that even though, because they have all these ideas about like what Islam teaches about, you have the believers and the unbelievers, and the unbelievers are treated horribly, and you have to adhere or they'll cut off this or whatever, and I don't want to get into all that. But a Christian theocracy would be very different from a Muslim theocracy, I will say that. But even among Christians, some would say, well, the whole thing about the theocracy, that wasn't meant for believers. That applied to the Hebrews back in the time of like David, or even before David. So that applied for that point in that time for those people, and it's not a universal application. So that may be, although I do think you could derive some principles from that. But rather than thinking about that, or rather than taking that viewpoint, I would say that let's kind of focus on what we learn in the New Testament regarding government. And again, there's not a whole lot there, but there's a couple of points. And the first point is that when, for example, the Jews were arguing, the Pharisees and the Sadducees were arguing with Jesus about taxes. See, that at the time, the Jews were under Roman occupation and they had to pay taxes, and a lot of people, just like now, a lot of people didn't want to, they didn't like that. They didn't want to pay money to these guys that were ruling them with an iron fist and that. And so they were trying to trick Jesus and get him into trouble with the Roman authorities. And so they said, and then of course I'm paraphrasing, but say, hey Jesus, what about taxes? Is it lawful? Should we be paying taxes to Caesar? Because everybody knew how corrupt and everything Caesar was. And so they're trying to trick him like that. And so then Jesus, of course, he's a lot smarter than the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So he said, hey, give me a coin. So somebody gave him a coin, a Roman coin. And of course, because it's a Roman coin, it had the picture, not really a picture, but the image of Caesar on it. And he said, okay, take a look at this coin. Whose image is on that? Whose writing is on that? And they said, well, it's Caesar's. And so then his response was, okay, then render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and render to God what is God's. So in other words, whatever, this is Caesar's system, so, give him what he's asking for. And, there's God's system, so give God what he's asking for. So that's one principle that we can take into account. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and render to God what is God's. The other major passage that touches in the New Testament that touches on governance is found in Romans 13, where it talks about the powers that be. And it's not so much, again, it's not necessarily a system, but more general principles to kind of guide things along. And in Romans 13, it says that the powers that be, so in other words, the governing authorities, are ordained by God. That means that God set them up. God put them in place. God put your king in place. God put your president in place. God put your prime minister in place. God ordained them to be in the position that they are. The powers that be are ordained by God. And then he talks about why. Why did God set it up this way? Or so in other words, what is the function or the purpose of these governors, of these politicians, if you will? What is the purpose of government? And the purpose of government, according to the Bible, is that these ministers, and when I say ministers, I'm not talking about a Christian minister, but I'm talking about like a governmental authority. That's what is meant by ministers. So, according to the Bible, according to Romans 13, these ministers are ordained by God to uphold civil society by executing judgment on or against evildoers. So in other words, their duty is to maintain civil peace so people can live without, having their house broken into, or without, being mugged or losing their life or whatever. The government, God put the government in place so we don't have anarchy. You can think of it that way. We have government so we can avoid the horrors of anarchy, of anybody doing whatever they want. That's what anarchy means. Anarchy means each individual gets to do whatever he wants and nobody can stop him. So, that would just leave the door wide open for anybody to commit murder, to commit theft, to, steal land or anything like that. And the Bible says, no, that's wrong. And God said, I'm going to put these people in place, these ministers in place, to put a damper on that stuff. Now you may say, well, okay, if these politicians or these ministers are appointed by God, they're still not doing what they're supposed to do because we still have crime, we still have this, we still have that. That may be. But then, according to Christian theology, if there's a minister or a politician or whatever, and he's not acting righteous, he's not doing what is right by the people, if he's being corrupt, if he's being greedy, if he's letting the criminals go scot-free, then that's between him and God. And God will judge him for that. So, so the politicians, they have a lot to answer for if they are not upholding righteousness. But anyways, that's pretty much what the Bible has to say about what the New Testament has to say about governance. God set up governments, set up ministers and so on, set up, governmental authority to maintain civil society, to punish the evildoers and execute judgment. That way, the whole world doesn't go to hell in a handbasket, as we say. And the other thing that I would note, that the Bible actually says a lot more about, society in the household level. So in other words, I'll just give a brief overview of that. So in other words, according to the Bible, I would say that the foundation of society forms the foundation of government. So if society is corrupt, if society is screwed up, then government can't help but be screwed up. So in other words, if your foundation is not solid, if your society is corrupt, if people don't treat each other rightly, then of course, okay, if your foundation is not solid, then the rest of the structure, if you think of a house, for example, if your foundation is off, if there's a crack in the foundation, if it's not solid, the whole house is not going to be solid and it's liable to collapse. It's unstructurally sound, or structurally unsound, I mean. So in other words, you have to have a good foundation if you want a good structure. And so if you stop and think about it, what is the foundation of society? It's the family. And I think if you look at it that way, then that really explains a lot about why things are so messed up now. Families are under attack. Divorce rate is crazy. Kids are out of control because parents don't do their job at parenting. I mean, there's so much we could get into, and that's probably a whole nother story, so I'm not going to get into it, but just think about that. If the family is messed up, then society's going to be messed up. And if society's messed up, then government and everything is going to be messed up. So I'd say, no wonder our government is so corrupt and so disappointing. It's because society is screwed up, and society is screwed up because the family is screwed up. And of course, there's going to be families here and there that do what is right and proper. But the thing is, especially if you consider American society, American families from a century or more ago, we've lost our way. We've lost our mooring. We've lost our guiding light, and so everybody's just kind of going crazy, doing whatever they feel like it. So if society and people are just doing whatever they feel like it, how can you blame the politicians for doing the same thing? Anyways, those are just some thoughts that I have on this whole thing about politics and corruption. And I think that you can't really say that a single form of government is ideal, because even perfect systems will be corrupted because they are implemented by imperfect people. Anyways, that's just what I think. What about you? What kind of thoughts do you have? Have you ever given thought to it about why there's so much corruption and why politics is so distasteful? If you have any ideas, please put them in the comments and let's have a discussion about that. Because, I think that if we don't get a handle on this, then society will just get worse and worse. And some people might say, oh, well, they'll just bring in AI judges and all that kind of stuff. AI can't be corrupted. I would say AI is not a magic solution. A lot of people think that AI, for example, is going to be an unbiased judge or it will implement the law unbiased. But the thing is, who writes the AI? Human beings. Human beings are not perfect, so AI is not going to be perfect. So, anyways, that's just what I think. What about you? Put your thoughts in the comments. Let's have a discussion. And in the meanwhile, I hope that I have given you something to think about. And I would appreciate it if you could give a thumbs up if you like the video, share it with your friends, and yeah, I'll talk to you later. Bye.